The other 3 pilots came out of the tent, and we all walked down to the fighters. Standing alongside my plane, I looked at my parachute. Then, as one man, all 9 pilots flung their chute packs onto the volcanic ash of the runway. The Zero wouldn't start. I turned the engine switch back and forth, right and left. Finally she caught, vibrating badly. The engine was no good. For 2 days this plane had fought in combat, and the stringent power demands of the dogfights had nearly burned the engine out. When I switched from one generator to the other, the propeller dragged almost to a stop, instead of slowing down slightly. Unless I used both generators, the propeller stayed dead. And normally I would never have attempted a takeoff with a plane in this condition. But now I was embarrassed. I looked at the other fighters. Mechanics were working on at least 4 of the other 8 planes. My difficulties were not unique. But who required a plane in perfect working order? Remember, Sakai, this is a one-way fight. You need cover only 450 miles in the air, not 900. You're not coming back from this mission. The engine's condition no longer seemed important. I waited for the fighter to warm up. The 8 bombers sped down the runway, one after the other. The first Zero moved into takeoff position. I followed, taxiing slowly, my wingmen behind me. On both sides of the runway, the mechanics and other pilots stood at attention, their caps off, waving handkerchiefs as we thundered down the strip and into the air. We formed into our Vs and turned toward the distant enemy fleet. I felt drained of all emotion, cold and lifeless. I turned. Iwo Jima was a speck on the horizon, growing smaller as we bored through the air, dwindling to a dot on the vast ocean. I felt so small. One man in an insignificant fighter plane, and the ocean stretching endlessly below me. I looked back again, barely able to make out Iwo. The horizon blurred and wavered before my eye. I felt dizzy and upset. My mother's face, tenuous and filmy, filling the sky. A vision, but so real. She smiled at me. She didn't know that soon I must die, that I was about to kill myself. I stared at her face. The vision faded slowly and disappeared. A terrible loneliness gripped me. I was lost in an endless sea. Everywhere below me there was only water, with the sky above. The horizon was misty and unreal, blurred with distance. I looked at the fighters in front of me, the bombers ahead and below. They did not seem to be moving, but were poised in mid-air, rocking gently, rising and dipping easily on the invisible swells of air. Was it all real? I shook my head to clear away the fog. Music! Listen! A piano! The Moonlight Sonata! Hatsuyo had played that for me. Hatsuyo! Her face appeared. Was it a vision? The music began to fade, then swelled louder and louder, crashing and thundering in my ears. I had never told her. Hatsuyo, I love you, I cried. No one knew, no one but me. I thought of her. I turned back and looked for Iwo Jima. I saw only the endless ocean. The music vanished. The sky was clear again. The drone of my engine beat strongly in my ears. The Zeros kept in perfect formation, precise, exact, moving together toward their flaming, blood-letting destiny. The loneliness fled. You are too maudlin, Sakai, I cursed. You are a pilot, a samurai. You wallow in your emotions. The mission. Do what you must do. I tried to plan the last moments in the air, the best method of diving into a carrier. What was the weakest spot? The stack. Dive into the stack? Take all 3 fighters and plunge together at the thin hull at the waterline? Hope there would be planes lined up on the deck, their tanks filled with fuel, their bombs loaded. Dive into the planes, explode their bombs and fuel tanks, and in a split second transform nearly 30,000 tons of ship and thousands of men into a shrieking, fiery, bloody hell. The ocean flowed beneath me. The minutes passed quickly until we saw, far off to the right, a column of smoke, flayed by the wind, drifting slowly over the water. This was the first landmark. Pagan Iceland, jutting 300 feet from the water, a barren, hideous mass of volcanic rock steaming and glowing with the heat of its fires far below the surface. It resembled the pictures of hell I had seen in my Buddhist books when I was a child. It was ironic. The last piece of land I was to see in my life was bubbling, boiling, flaming, and hideous. 40 minutes later, black clouds appeared on the horizon before us. They towered many thousands of feet above the surface, lashed the sea below with high winds and torrential rains. I looked at the map. The enemy task force, as pinpointed by our scouts, should be lying somewhere beneath those fierce squalls. Now that we were so close, I thought of nothing but the warships cruising along beneath the storm. Everything except the ships and the dive I was to make was blotted from my mind. The old excitement was there too. It was the same all over again. I thought only of combat, the ships, my plane, the dive, and the interceptors which might appear. We were within the routine scouting radius of the enemy fighters. They might spot our formations at any moment, and the warship's radar were certain to have caught us in their scopes. The 8 bombers nosed down, our fighters close behind. At 16,000 feet we dropped into a thin cloud deck, were engulfed for several seconds in blinding white, then broke through and continued to descend. At 13,000 feet something bright flashed in the sky. There, far ahead and several thousand feet above us. The brilliant flash was repeated. It could only be sunlight glancing off a plane's wing. I saw the first fighter, a Hellcat, its broad body and wings unmistakable, dropping through the clouds. Another, more. How many were there? Look at them. Dropping through the clouds, one after the other, a seemingly endless column of the dangerous fighters. I fired a burst from my guns to warn the other pilots. The squadron leader and Muto banked their wings in response. The American radar had pinpointed our position perfectly. The column of fighters descended from the clouds less than a mile ahead of us, and only half a mile above. I counted the enemy planes as they ripped through the fluffy overcast. I lost count at 17. They saw us. The 17th fighter, the last one I had time to count, rolled abruptly to the left and dove. Immediately the other fighters swung around and screamed down at us. Miura's words boomed at me. "Refuse to accept battle, keep your planes together." Fine words. But how? Look at those fighters come. Hellcats were everywhere, many of them pulling out of their dives to attack from beneath our planes, even still more of them continuing to burst through the clouds to take us from above. A second column of more than 20 fighters pounced wildly on Muto's trio of fighters. Still another column, more than 30 planes it seemed, came out of their dives, climbing rapidly, gunning for the bombers from beneath. I held my breath as the Hellcats clawed into the bombers. In 2 blinding explosions, the first and second bombers disappeared, blown into tiny pieces of wreckage as their torpedoes went off with shattering roars which shook my plane. Now the Hellcats were within firing range of Muto's trio. The 3 Zeros sliced up into a wicked loop, evading the Hellcats. They did not attempt to return the fire, as they could have done. I pounded my fist helplessly against the glass. Muto had a dead shot. He could have rolled to the right and gunned 2 fighters from the air without even trying. Another Hellcat column raced in against my formation. I hauled back on the stick, going up and around in a tight loop, my 2 wingmen sticking to me. The column was too long. We came out of the loop to find several fighters plunging in, their wings ablaze with their firing machine guns. I rolled, fast. More fighters. Another loop. Twice. Roll to the left. Snap out of it. Here they come. How many are there? Take her up and around. Refuse to accept combat. You can follow orders just so far. I could not follow mine. Not now. Not with the sky filled with Hellcats. I could evade just so long, and that would be all. I snapped around in a tight turn at a diving Hellcat. He flew right into my shells. The fighter flipped wildly through the air and then dropped for the ocean, trailing a fast-growing plume of smoke. I had no time to watch him go down. I kicked the rudder bar and yanked the stick over hard, just in time. A Hellcat skidded crazily past the Zero, and still they came in, one after the other. I didn't even have time to jettison the belly tank. Then the last of the column was passed, dropping toward the ocean, beginning their long pullouts to come back again. I jerked the toggle and the tank dropped free. I turned back. My wingmen were still with me. Good! They had followed my instructions to the letter, concentrating entirely on my plane, matching me turn for turn. I was soaking wet. I tried to wipe the sweat away from my face. No time. All 16 fighters of the column which had jumped my planes were out of their dives, skidding around in long climbing turns, coming back at us. Again, an eternity of diving, looping, skidding, rolling. Stick over, back, forward, right, left. Kick the rudder bar, skid her around, bright, flashing tracers. They missed and continued to miss. The American pilots had poor aim. I glanced at the bombers. It was a slaughter. Slow, sluggish with their torpedoes, they wallowed helplessly in the air, unprotected by the Zeros which fought frantically to fend off the Hellcats. A ball of fire disappeared in a searing burst of light. Another torpedo had exploded. In less than a minute, 7 bombers were gone. Not even the fuselage or a whole wing of one plane remained. 7 bombers had disappeared in as many explosions. The Zeros fared hardly any better. I saw 2 of our fighters engulfed in flame, swooping and rolling crazily. The pilots didn't even try to get out. They stayed with their fighters, burning to death. I failed to see a single Hellcat in trouble. Except for the one fighter I had shot up, there were just as many of the Grummons in the air. We had little or no chance of evading combat by attempting to outmaneuver a horde of fighters which, it seemed, could match us turn for turn. The Hellcats were fully as agile as our own planes, much faster, and able to outclimb and outdive us. Only the inexperience of their pilots saved us. Had they been better, every Zero would have been shot down in less than a minute. As it was, mine was the only Japanese formation to be seen anywhere in the sky. The Hellcats, which had wiped out the other planes, now joined the original 16 fighters which had worked us over. Flashing blue wings and white stars, wings blazing with firing guns. Above us, below us, to the right and to the left, Hellcats everywhere. They reminded me of Leh, when 12 of us tried to shoot up a single bomber. We shredded our own formations in our eagerness to get at the enemy. Now the Hellcats were doing the same. Their organization was gone. They skidded wildly, frantically evading their own fire, trying to get out of the way of other pilots hungry for blood. I watched a fighter come at use, guns blazing, then forced to roll away as another Grumman sliced in from the side, paying no attention to the airspace around him. Their eagerness saved our lives. We flew in the middle of a tremendous Hellcat formation. The enemy fighters spent more time trying to avoid collisions than firing at us. But I saw no way of breaking off the fight. We were 400 miles from Iwo Jima, and still 50 miles or so from the American carriers, which we had not yet seen and might not be able to find. Even if we did, how were we to break through more than 60 Hellcats, each of which was so much faster than the Zero? Fate gave us a slim chance. The running air fight drifted toward a cumulus cloud hovering over the water. A Hellcat flashed by, leaving an opening in the ranks of the circling fighters. I rolled over and shoved the stick forward, diving with full power into the protecting invisibility of the cloud. I glanced back. My 2 wingmen were still with me. For several minutes the world went mad. I saw nothing as the raging winds within the cloud flipped the Zero crazily. Then it was over. I was out, the fighter again in control. I turned to see 2 Zeros, far below my own plane, spinning wildly as they hurtled free. In a few seconds they were out of their spins and climbing to rejoin me. The sky was clear of Hellcats. We had flung them off. The irony of our survival. We had escaped almost insurmountable odds, only to save ourselves to die. We reformed into a V and turned to the south again. We were relieved at our escape, but the immediate future justified no elation. The clouds thickened as we drew nearer to the enemy fleet. They became thicker and thicker, and the airspace between the cloud bottoms and the ocean surface dwindled to a mere 700 feet. Blinding sheets of rain fell with such force that at times the Zero heeled over dangerously on one wing, buffeted by the weight of the water pouring down like an avalanche. We had to keep going. The clouds dropped lower and lower toward the ocean. We were in a long, gradual descent, maintaining altitude directly beneath the storm base. Then we were only 60 feet above the surface, whipped into foaming whitecaps. If anything, the storm increased its fury. The wind shrieked louder than the roar of the engine. The Zero buffeted and shook from the terrible force of the rain slamming against the wings and fuselage. For long moments the torrents blinded me, covering the windscreen with an impenetrable flood. We could go no lower. We were blind now. I saw only sheets of rain all around me, forcing us toward the ocean surface. The water became indistinguishable from the rain. Another foot lower, and for all I knew, we would smash into the sea. 30 minutes went by. The storm raged unabated. Still we saw nothing but rain and, at brief moments, the storm-lashed ocean surface. According to my map, I was supposed to be directly over the enemy task force. We had failed even to catch a glimpse of the vast fleet. The sky grew darker. It was past 7 p.m. I was worried. Even if we succeeded in fighting through the rain, the fast-approaching darkness would hide the fleet from our sight. There was no moon at this time of the month. I had to make a decision quickly. If we kept forging ahead, groping indefinitely in the darkness, the ocean surface blinded to us, our fuel would give out and we would crash without any hope of survival. A death without meaning, without purpose. I glanced back at the two fighters hugging my tail. What about those two men? They were following me without question, ready to accept whatever I chose. If I winged over and dove full speed into the water, they would be no more than a fraction of a second behind my plane when it crashed. Their fate lay in my hands, and the thought upset me. What use to go on? To plunge into the ocean, to let the men back at Iowa think that either we had reached the enemy ships or had been blown out of the air trying. Was that the course of honor? No. I checked the compass and swung around in a wide turn, the two other Zeros close behind. I was not even sure of my location at the moment. We had fought wildly, fled into the cloud, and then wandered blindly through the storm. I might be anywhere over the water. Even a 180-degree turn could send me due south, instead of back toward Iwo Jima. But I must turn, I must try. Captain Miura's grim words came back to me. You must dive against the enemy carriers together. I almost turned back again to search for the ships. I was still an officer in the Imperial Navy, where orders were absolute. For any man to question those orders, just or unreasonable, was unheard of. Even if we made home, how could I again face the same wing commander who had sent me out on this mission? It was a tremendous struggle. I was beside myself with indecision and anguish. I know now, years later, that I acted in the only sensible way. But even today, I cannot describe in words the emotional struggle required to overcome the years of strict and brutal discipline, the lifelong adherence to orders. In those terrible moments in the Zero's cockpit, I fought successfully to break the chain of discipline and tradition. Even if the three of us found the enemy ships, even if we penetrated the fighters, even if our dives were perfect, what could we accomplish with our three small light fighter planes, without bombs, carrying only some cannon shells and machine gun ammunition, which would explode briefly and then be gone? These two young pilots behind me, trusting their lives to me, had shown outstanding skill in following me doggedly through the violent evasive maneuvers to escape the Hellcats. They had flown unflinchingly into the heart of a thunderhead, no mean feat in itself. They deserved a better fate than to sink in the wreckage of their planes beneath the ocean. They belonged in Japan. They deserved the opportunity to fly and fight again. So my decision was made. But a long and dangerous flight lay ahead of us, filled with more dangers than I cared to face. There was the matter of orientation. Our engines were anything but in good operating shape. NAP-2C, Hajime Shiga's plane, especially, was in dangerous condition. The violent thermals within the thunderhead had torn the engine cowling clear off his plane. I waved for him to draw abreast of my own fighter, and he signalled by hand that his engine was faulty and might quit at any moment. What could I tell him? I waved back for him to stay close to me. Nap 2C Weiji Shirai's plane was in better shape, and after Shiga's plane had taken its new position, he drew up on the other side. A few minutes later I checked my course with the setting sun, now showing brilliantly through the broken clouds. We were past the squall. Each passing minute took us into clearer and calmer air. The minutes dragged on slowly. Again I was in the position dreaded by all flyers, over the ocean with darkness setting in, with no way to check with any accuracy my location, with fuel running low, and a destination which would be shrouded in darkness as a protection from marauding enemy bombers. I marvelled at the fighter's engine, which continued to beat with amazing regularity. One generator had burned out. The motor's continued operation was astounding. I took no precaution to conserve fuel, as I had 2 years before when I limped home from Guadalcanal to Rabaul. I did not see how the overtaxed engine could function under such stringent conditions. By now I cared little if it failed. I was trying. That was enough. If the plane actually lost its power, I would be spared the moment I dreaded more and more with every passing second. I would lose honor when I returned to Iwo Jima, that I appreciated only too well. 2 hours after I had turned back for Iwo, the ocean was lost in total darkness. I saw absolutely nothing below me, only the stars which gleamed brightly in the sky. Nearly another hour went by. This was it, the fateful moment. If I had set the fighter on its correct course, Iwo should be below me now. If not, at least I would never feel the freezing embrace of the ocean when the zero struck. Several more minutes passed. I stared at the horizon, hoping to see something, a blur, a black shape lifting its outline against the stars. Something was there, something big, black, irregular, rising steeply at one end. Iwo! We were back! I nosed down, followed by Shiga and Shirai. Iwo lay shrouded in gloom, blacked out as we circled overhead. Out of the darkness there appeared 4 weak lights. They were like blinding, wonderful beacons to me. Lantern lights along the runway of the main strip. They flickered briefly in the signal to land. The men on the island had recognized the sound of our engines. A feeling of relief washed over me, and I almost went limp with the sudden cessation of the strain which had been building up for almost 3 hours during the return flight. 4 lights barely showed the runway. Normally we used 20, but the others had been destroyed by bombs. 4 lights or 40, what did I care? After what we had been through, I felt I could have landed in darkness. Then I was down, taxiing off the runway as the 2 fighters landed behind me. The lights went out. A crowd of pilots and mechanics ran toward our planes. For a moment I stared at them as they approached. I hardly felt able to face them. I dropped to the ground and walked to the command post. No one tried to stop me as I walked through the crowd, looking neither to the left nor to the right. Every man understood my feelings, and they stepped aside as I walked across the field, my 2 wingmen following. In the darkness I stumbled against a body. I stepped back suddenly. There was no movement, no sound. "Who's that?" I shouted. No reply. I approached the man who cowered on the ground. I could barely make out the pilot's uniform. I bent down to look at his face. "Mutor!" The flyer sat in dejection, his head resting on his arms. "Muto, were you wounded?" The unhappy man lifted his head and looked at me. "No," he said slowly, "I wasn't wounded." He rose to his feet and stared in wonder at Shiga and Shirai, who waited behind me. You brought back your wingmen too," he gasped. He stared at the ground, moaning. "Sakai! Sakai! Spit on me, my friend! Spit on me!" Tears streamed down his face. "I was forced back," he cried in anguish. "Alone." On the ground before Muto were the gifts of the other pilots who had welcomed him when his lone fighter appeared over the ocean and landed on the island. Again, the modest gifts all the other men had in the world testified to their attempts to cheer up the dejected pilot. I grasped his shoulder. "I know how you feel, Muto, but nothing can be done now. It is too late. All that is over with. It is in the past." I shook him slightly. "Muto." I pointed to the command post. We will go in together." He nodded. We could not look at each other. And then something snapped inside me. Suddenly cold anger at everything which had passed this terrible day gripped me. I thought of Muto, brilliant in the air, already an ace, willing to fight at any time, anywhere. I thought of him weeping abjectly, sorrowful, fearing that he had shown himself a coward when he had been sent out on a fool's mission. I swore that no matter what happened, if any superior officer attempted to vent his wrath on the young pilot by beating him, I would throw all caution to the winds and throw myself on that man and reduce him to a pulp. I have no idea what brought on the sudden burst of anger. One moment I was fearing our audience with our superior, the next I seethed with rage. Captain Miura sat impassively at his desk. He listened, intent on every word, as I told him what had occurred, of the swarms of hellcats, of the burning fighters which never had a chance, of the bombers which exploded, one after the other, 7 within a minute. Miura lifted his eyes and looked deeply into mine. "Thank you, Sakai," he said quietly. That was all. Then Muto spoke. Much of what he said, of course, was confirmation of my own words. Again the captain spoke but 3 words. "Thank you, Muto." We saluted and stepped back. Captain Miura sat without moving a muscle of his body, his face dark, agony in his eyes. I felt grief for this man who had ordered his men on a mission doomed to failure before it began, but who had done so because he felt he had no other choice, because it was best for Japan. Right now, however, Captain Miura appeared only as a man grieving for the men, his men, who would never return. Shiga and Shirai left the tent with us. A man ran after us. It was Commander Nakajima. He grasped my shoulders, relief on his face. "Sakai," he exclaimed, "I despaired ever of seeing you again." "But," I protested. "You have no need for apologies," he interrupted before I could speak further. "Do you not think I know you so well, my friend? Every man on this island knows what happened today, that the only thing for you to do was to return. Don't scowl so. We will still have our chance. We will still strike back. It is good to have you here again, Saburo. Very good." Nakajima's words melted the ice in my heart. He understood then. I was not alone with my feelings, but not even his kind words could drive away completely the anger which revolted me. The other flyers ran up to us, offering cigarettes, candy, what food they had. Other men had gone ahead to the billet and rushed some warm food for us to eat. One after the other, the pilots came in with canned goods they had foraged somehow from other installations on the island. We could only say our thanks and refuse. I could never have forced a morsel down my throat. An hour later, an orderly rushed into the room, his chest heaving from the exertion of the long run from the radio shack. "A message just came through," he shouted, "from South Iwo. One of the bombers just landed there. The crew is safe." So, another man in the air today had shared my feelings. The pilot had released his torpedo and run for it, fully aware that not in 1,000 years could he have broken through the wall of fire thrown up by the Hellcats. The news washed much of the tension away. It was good to know that Muto and I were not the only ones who had broken with the unbreakable chain of tradition and orders. Chapter 28. Our pathetic little group vowed to fight to the last man alongside the surviving army troops. We received weapons and ammunition and accepted the fact that our cause was lost. How could we doubt our impending destruction? If the Americans had taken Saipan, which seemed likely by now, if they had absolute supremacy of the air, If their warships sneered at our fleet and cruised insolently up and down off Iwo Jima, were they not able to storm our few defenses? Iwo radio kept calling frantically for reinforcements from Yokosuka. We begged for more fighters. We begged for anything which could fly. Yokosuka could do nothing. The 30 Zero fighters which we had flown to Iwo Jima were all the fighter planes available. There were no more. Chaos reigned within the high command in Tokyo. Glad cries and shouts of happiness awoke us one morning shortly after the usual devastating bombardment. The Navy could spare us no planes, but we were not forgotten. Several transport ships appeared over the horizon, making for the island. We ran down to the shore, shouting and laughing at the unexpected good fortune, only to see the ships erupt in geysers of flame and water, sunk before our very eyes by American submarines which had waited in anticipation of just such a move. That last catastrophe was decisive. It was obvious to us all that we could offer only token resistance, that within an hour or two after a landing, the Americans would control Iwo. Who then, of all the men on the forsaken hump of volcanic ash, with its bubbling sulphur springs, could have foreseen the actual turn of events? Who among us would have dared to prophesy that the Americans would throw away their priceless opportunity to take the island with minimum casualties on their side? We felt we had but a few days in which to remain alive. The Americans did not come. Every hour of the day lookouts posted from one end of the island to the other, searching the sea from Miyatsurubachi, looked for the invasion fleet. From time to time a nervous lookout would imagine he saw something on the ocean surface and would sound the alarm. Bells, bugles, sticks beat against drums. Anything and everything which could make noise broke the quiet of the island with a terrific clamour. We would rush from our cots, grim-faced, ready to fight, clutching our weapons, but nothing ever happened. We did not know, of course, that the Americans already had turned for the Philippines. They did not return to Iwo Jima for another 8 months. 8 months during which Lieutenant General Tadamachi Kuribayashi moved onto the island, bringing with him 17,500 soldiers, as well as nearly 6,000 naval personnel. He built Iwo Jima into a mighty fortress, buttressed with pillboxes, powerful cave defences, elaborate tunnels. He poured men onto the island until Iwo Jima could contain no more. Many of Japan's military leaders stated later that the war would have ended sooner if the Americans had attacked Iwo Jima in July of 1944, instead of waiting so long to do so. To these men, the Philippines invasion was a vast and costly operation, highly successful for the Americans, but an insignificant campaign which did little to hasten the defeat which was already in sight. The long-expected invasion came finally on February 19, 1945, in the form of a stupendous gathering of military strength. According to the United States Navy, that invasion force required a total of 495 ships, including 17 aircraft carriers. The official American government information stated further that the incredible number of 1,170 fighters and bombers was employed against Iwo Jima. A total of 75,144 American fighting men engaged in the most bitter struggle of the entire war in their attempt to take the island. Of these, the Americans counted 5,124 men killed, as well as 16,000 wounded. The island was not declared secure until March 16th, when the last Japanese defenders were killed. After several false invasion alarms, a message from Yokosuka astounded us. The Yokosuka command informed us that all staff officers and pilots were to return to Japan by courier planes, which were already on their way to us. The unexpected reprieve elated the flyers. We had been prepared to die, fighting on the ground, and now life was offered us again. We dropped our guns and ran to the main strip to join with the mechanics and other ground personnel in filling the hundreds of craters which pitted the runway. We had never expected a miracle of this nature, and so had made no attempt to repair the field after the July 4th debacle. I was among the flyers turned coolie and went at my labours with feverish determination. Not all the men were pleased, of course. There were those who would remain behind. The maintenance crews, for example, as well as the army garrison. Not one man among them spoke a word against the decision to leave them behind, but their faces indicated clearly their envy and, as was to be expected, often their resentment. Late that afternoon, the first of the courier planes landed. They were obsolete bombers, which sneaked in low over the water, one by one, to escape detection by the radar of any American ships which might be prowling the area. Yokosuka was taking no chances. It was fortunate indeed for us that no American fighters appeared during the landing and departure of the courier planes. 7 twin-engined bombers arrived to take back the men selected to return to Japan. Even here the military caste system was rigidly adhered to. Not even our desperate plight could negate centuries of tradition. Each evacuee filed into a bomber in the order of his rank. No other factor was considered. My own group of 11 non-commissioned officers and enlisted men were left behind. There were so many officers of higher rank before us that no room was left. We stared hollowly as the last plane lurched into the air and headed for Japan. The next day a single plane returned to the island to pick us up. I gaped in disbelief at the flying wreck which staggered onto the runway. Not only was the plane obsolete, but it was so badly in need of repair that it seemed impossible for it to fly. The plane had barely managed to reach Iwo. With the 11 of us aboard, it reeled and swerved dangerously down the runway. It could not reach flying speed, and the pilot taxied back, one engine spitting and belching forth clouds of smoke. For 2 hours the mechanics worked silently to repair the bad engine. The 2 hours were like weeks to us. We kept looking at the sky, afraid that hellcats would burst out of the blue to pour tracers into the weary old plane. A single fighter could doom us to remain on the island. Finally the mechanics were through, and the engine turned over as smoothly as its battered parts would allow. The ground crew looked so forlorn as we climbed aboard that I turned and called to them, "We'll be back, and soon, with new fighters." They waved to us, afraid to entertain any hope. None of them dreamed that for nearly 8 months Iwo would be ignored by the enemy. We were airborne only 10 minutes when the airplane shook violently. A steady vibration rattled our teeth. I looked out the window at the right engine, which vibrated and shook wildly in its mountings. How was this incredible old junk pile going to carry all of us 650 miles to Japan? The co-pilot, a youngster about 20 years of age, walked back through the cabin. "Warrant Officer Sakai, sir, could you come forward and help us out?" He was pale and shaking almost as badly as the airplane. I knew the answer before he had finished speaking. "Turn around," I snapped. "With that engine we'll never make Japan. You'll have to go back for some more repair work." The crew obeyed me at once. Back at Iwo we had a long, worried inspection of the troublesome engine. It looked like fouled plugs. We inserted new spark plugs and took off again. The bomber cruised steadily toward Japan. But our worries were far from over. An hour and a half later we were in the middle of a violent rainstorm. Sheets of water battered heavily at the flying wreck. The plane leaked like a sieve. The co-pilot returned again and asked me if I would come forward. The pilot was hardly any older, 22 at the most. "Sir, should we try to go over the cloud deck or fly beneath it?" "Take it below," I ordered. The storm continued without let-up, at times hemming us in to zero visibility. It was fully as bad as the storm I had encountered only days before, trying to find the American task force off Saipan. The bomber skidded wildly, plunged up and down in the murderous air currents. We went lower and lower until the pilot was skimming directly over the foaming water. Beads of sweat dripped down his face. He was becoming panicky. In desperation he turned his pale face to me and bleated plaintively, "Sir, where are we now?" That was the silliest question I had ever heard from a pilot. For a few seconds I was speechless with astonishment. "Get out of that seat! I'm taking over!" I shouted. He wasted no time in clambering out of his seat to relinquish the controls. It was dead reckoning all the way. For another 90 minutes I flew blind, fighting the sluggish plane through the winds and rain. Then the familiar peninsulas south of Tokyo Bay hove into view. Cries of jubilation shook the bomber as the crew and passengers cheered. We landed at the Kisarazu bomber base across the bay from Yokosuka. I looked around at the broad airfield. Japan! I was home again, on my own soil. There had been so many times when I was convinced that never again would I see my country. What a difference from Iwo Jima, only a few hours' flight from here. To me and to the 10 other men who had come out of the volcanic Hades behind us, the pure and sweet water of Japan seemed the most desirable thing on earth, water which did not have the horrible, gritty taste of the collected rain on Iwo. Every one of us ran across the field to an open pipeline by the control tower. We turned the faucet on and let the cool liquid gush forth. I drank and drank, enjoying immensely the feel and taste of the water as it washed down my throat and into my body. But Iwo Jima was too close behind me. Muto and I must have thought of the same thing together, for suddenly we could drink no more. We both thought of our friends who had died only a few days before from wounds inflicted by the shells pouring onto the island, spitting out volcanic dust and crying to us in their agony, "Water! Water!" begging for the water of which there had been none. Chapter 29. A month after my return to Yokosuka, I was promoted to the rank of ensign. After 11 years, I had reached the status of a regular officer. It was an all-time record in the Navy. Several men who died in the midget submarine attack against Pearl Harbor received double promotions and were moved up to officer rank 10 years after their enlistment. Their award, however, was more in keeping with tradition since the promotions were posthumous. I was the first Japanese enlisted man to achieve my memorable regular officer's status, alive, within the space of 11 years. Muto and I were reassigned to the Yokosuka Air Wing. We were not to be sent back to Iwo Jima. So acute was the shortage of pilots and planes that the High Command was forced to leave the island without air protection for many months to come. That the Philippines were now destined for invasion was clearly apparent, and a flow of planes and pilots bolstered our forces in the islands. We saw Commander Nakajima off when he left for his new post at Cebu. My new assignment included a welcome change from the disastrous beatings we had suffered at Iwo Jima. In addition to my training duties with new flyers, I was made a test pilot. The High Command had ordered mass production of new fighter planes to replace the Zero. Even the most obstinate staff officer could not deny that the once mighty Zero had lost its sting, that the enemy's new fighters far outclassed us in the air. In the Marianas and other sea air engagements, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat had clearly established its superiority in almost every performance respect. From the South Pacific came disturbing reports of new models of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, which were great improvements over the first P-38s to enter combat late in 1942. With new engines, the Lightnings had gained greatly in all-around performance. Once the big twin-boomed fighter was brought into a dogfight, the Zero's superior maneuverability gave our pilots an excellent chance. Otherwise, the Lightning's great speed, its sensational high-altitude performance, and especially its ability to dive and climb much faster than the Zero presented insuperable problems for our flyers. For the P-38 pilots, flying at great heights, chose when and where they wanted to fight, with disastrous results for our men. No less troublesome was the Corsair, a powerful gull-winged American Navy fighter which operated mostly from land bases. Not as maneuverable as the Hellcat, the Corsair nevertheless was much faster than the Zero and had tremendous diving speed. Our Army pilots in Burma reported encountering another new enemy plane, the P-51 Mustang, which outperformed the Zero on an even greater range. The Mustangs made their combat debut as escorts for the four-engined Liberator bombers in November of 1943, and the performance of the new models was simply astounding. The Army pilots flying the Hayabusa, Oscar, were outflown and outfought consistently by the sleek American plane, and it was only too obvious to all that we were totally unprepared for the great superfortresses which had first struck at Kyushu from their China airfields. The light Army fighters which intercepted these planes were woefully ineffective against the fast, heavily armed armoured bombers. If the B-17 had been a formidable opponent, the B-29 was insuperable. Now that the Marianas were in American hands and rapidly being transformed into great airfields, all Japan expected heavy attacks by the B-29s. The defensive concepts adapted by the High Command came too late and were also inadequate. The majority of our fighters were Zeros, well adapted to our offensive tactics earlier in the war, but virtually useless against the B-29s. Most of our bomber pilots still flew the Mitsubishi Betty, now too old, too slow, and possessed of the unhappy trait of exploding violently into flame under enemy fire. The loss of Saipan furnished the impetus to discard the cobwebs in our planning. The High Command screamed for the new fighters, designed specifically to overcome the Zero's shortcomings. In September, I began test flying 2 new fighter planes. The Shiden, Lightning in Japanese, known by its code name of George to the enemy, was designed as an interceptor to outfight the Hellcat. It lacked the Zero's range and was heavier, but it possessed great speed and 4 20mm cannon. It afforded pilots safety through armor plating and excellent structure. I found it surprisingly maneuverable for its heavy weight. It gained this flexibility partially through an automatic flap system. Unfortunately, the Shiden's flight characteristics were treacherous and demanded an experienced pilot. Too many men with little time behind the controls of fighter planes never lived to fly the Shiden into combat. Their familiarization flights killed them. The Raiden, Thunderbolt in Japanese, called Jack by the Americans, was designed specifically to fight heavy bombers like the B-29. For this purpose, its performance was excellent, and many of our pilots compared the airplane to Germany's great Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighter. 4 20mm cannon gave the Raiden an excellent punch against a bomber, and its ability to fly at more than 400 miles an hour, extraordinary in those days, overcame the Zero's trouble in this respect. Even with its cannon and heavy steel armor plate, the Raiden could outclimb the Zero. It was well suited to bomber attack but, like the Shiden, demanded high skill from its pilots. The overemphasis on speed and armament made the plane loggy in aerobatics. Compared to the Zero in this respect, it flew like a truck. We suffered appalling losses in training. Later, when the Hellcats and Mustangs roamed over Japan proper, those pilots in Raidens who opposed the enemy fighters discovered all too late the airplane's inability to maneuver. Moreover, the production of these new models proved painfully slow. Despite the orders of the High Command, the old Zero remained our fighter mainstay. The test pilot assignment afforded me the opportunity once again to visit with my family. I left Yokosuka early one Sunday morning to travel to my uncle's house, passing through Tokyo on the way. During my absence, the city had deteriorated further. Although no bombings had occurred since the Doolittle attack of 1942, the city appeared drab and lifeless. Most of the stores were closed, their windows empty. The significance of this was clear. There were no goods to sell, and the owners were away, working in war plants. The few stores which remained open hardly resembled the colourful and well-stocked establishments I once knew. Few goods were on display, and for the most part these were crude substitutes. The Allied blockade of Japan was pinching the national stomach severely. Often I passed official demolition crews tearing down long stretches of buildings and private homes. Hundreds of men ripped and broke up buildings in order to clear wide fire breaks in the heart of the city, in anticipation of the bombings which all Japan feared. The families being forced from their homes stood in small groups on the street, watching with sorrowful faces as the labor gangs ripped their homes to pieces. I had seen bombing before. To me, the demolition work was no more than a pitiful attempt, a wasted effort which would do little good against masses of incendiary bombs. Tokyo's wooden homes and commercial buildings would flare up like matchboxes. Most of the men on the streets wore overalls, or the Wartim civilian standard suite, patterned after military uniforms. Not once did I see a single woman wearing her Sunday best, the colourful kimonos of pre-war days. Instead, they were attired in black slacks, in the drab and nondescript mompe, baggy and colourless kimono pants. Nearly every street corner had its long queues of women and children, shuffling patiently in line as they waited for rations. The shortage of wholesome food was obvious. Faces were pinched and bleak, eloquent testimony to the ersatz food being forced on the civilians. Tokyo was depressingly morbid, and I could not get out of the city quickly enough. Not everything had changed. Corner radios blasted at the ears painfully, trumpeting war songs and chanting phony victories. Posters marred the faces of buildings everywhere in the city, exhorting the people to greater production, to bear with the shortages until Japan won the war. I felt ill at ease. Never had I dreamed I would see such abject misery in the faces of my own people. I waited for several minutes before the door to my uncle's home. Someone was playing the piano. It could only be Hatsuyo. I listened for a while, hearing the first music in months. The music stopped when I knocked at the door. I heard Hatsuyo running to greet me. Her smile was a beam of sunshine. "Saburo! Oh, how wonderful you look!" she exclaimed. For several moments she stared at me. "We all prayed for your return, Saburo," she said quietly. "We have been most fortunate. Here you are again, well, and an officer." The familiar house was the same. It was still a home to me, more welcoming than any others because of Hatsuyo. "You look beautiful," I said. "The most beautiful thing I have seen in many long months. But why are you so dressed up? You look radiant," I marveled. She wore a tasteful kimono dress, every line neat and perfect on her slim body. She laughed at me. "Saburo, sometimes you are a fool. Don't you know that this is a special occasion? I have kept this dress waiting for you, waiting patiently to wear it when I received a newly commissioned officer." She smiled. "Here, see these sleeves? I must apologize for the kimono, my cousin." The sleeves had been cut to half length. "The government has ordered us to cut off the long dancing sleeves," she cried gaily, whirling about the room with her arms out before her. "Don't you know," she whispered in mock seriousness, "that the dancing sleeves are unfit for the emergency?" I smiled at her. "Hatsuyo, where is everyone?" I asked. "Isn't the family at home?" She shook her head. "Only I am here to welcome you, Saburo. Father will be out the rest of the day." He has volunteered for home defense work and is receiving his refresher training in the Army Reservists Corps at a high school nearby. Michio will be working overtime in his factory tonight. Her face clouded. "Mother is out too, Saburo. She is trying to buy something for you, from the black market. She wants so much to have something special to welcome you." I stared at Hatsuyo. If my aunt were caught, she would be in serious trouble with the police. "Why did she do that?" I gasped. "Doesn't she know what could happen to her?"
I know, Saburo, but she wanted so much to make your welcome more pleasant."
I shook my head. "Well, let us hope that everything is all right. I should have told her when I called that none of the men ever visit a civilian home today without bringing their own meals." I showed her my lunchbox, as well as gifts I had purchased from the Yokosuka Post Exchange. Hatsuyo was embarrassed. One does not normally bring home toilet necessities as gifts. "Thank you, Saburo," she blushed. "Times are not normal, and thank you." She quickly changed the subject. "Come here and sit down, Saburo. Now tell me everything that has happened since we last saw you. What happened at Iwo Jima? We have heard nothing on the radio, except that there has been terrible fighting at Saipan." I stammered clumsily. We were under strict orders not to discuss what had happened at Iwo Jima. The catastrophe suffered by our forces was classified as top secret, and no one outside of the military knew what really had taken place. I changed the subject, talking excitedly about the new interceptors I had flown in tests. "If we have enough of these new fighters, we may be able to turn the tide," I said. "They have marvelous speed, and their 4 cannons should be enough to destroy any plane flying." This was not exactly true, I realized. If things kept up at the training fields, with the student pilots crashing daily, we'd have precious few of the new planes to get into the air when the time for combat arrived. A half-hour went by while we discussed everything but the subject which interested me most. I stole side glances at Hatsuyo, studying her profile, watching the way she talked, the way her eyes shone when she became excited, the way she moved her arms, her poise in walking, the way her cheeks wrinkled when she smiled. I talked with Hatsuyo, but I spoke without paying any attention to the words. I was in love with her. I wanted to tell her how I felt. I wanted to shout the pent-up words. More than 2 months ago, when it seemed I was only minutes away from eternity, when Iwo Jima faded over the horizon and I saw a vision of Hatsuyo, I vowed that, if by some miracle I lived, I would tell her my feelings. Now. I couldn't. Nothing had changed. I was still a pilot, even if I had achieved officer's status. I knew I would fly in combat again, and the burning Zeros I had seen falling before the Hellcat's guns left a fiery imprint on my mind. I knew the odds were against me, that the very next time I flew into battle, I could be one of those men hurtling toward Earth, out of control, burning alive. Then, suddenly, she interrupted me. "Saburo," she spoke quietly, "did you know that Fujiko-san has been married?" I hadn't known. "After it was all over," she continued, "Fujiko-san married a pilot, a flyer, like yourself," she added defiantly. I started to speak, but she went on. "Saburo, why aren't you married yet? You are no longer a youngster, you know. You are 27 years of age. You have become someone. You are an officer now. You should take a wife." "But I tell you, Hatsuyo, I don't know any women I like that much," I protested. "Didn't you love Fujiko-san?" I didn't know what to say. A clumsy silence settled over us. Hatsuyo walked across the room and turned on the radio, tuning in to the afternoon symphonic hour. The music eased the awkwardness of the moment. She returned and sat by me again. "Well," she smiled, "perhaps, Saburo, we should recommend some young women who would better suit your taste." Hatsuyo was making me uncomfortable. She refused to look away, but stared directly into my eyes. I became flustered and started to speak, but could only stammer. I rose quickly and walked to the window, staring out. The beautiful flowers were gone. Vegetables had replaced them, I noticed. "There are many women as beautiful as Fujiko-san, Saburo," Hatsuyo said. She had walked after me, and now stood almost directly behind me. "Hatsuyo!" I shouted, whirling around. "I don't want to talk about it again. Please!" My outburst startled her. "We've talked this over so many times. The facts don't change. Nothing has changed. I am a flyer, don't you understand? Every time I go up, there is the chance that I will never return. Every time. Sooner or later it is certain to happen. Sooner or later." I was upset and distressed. Why did she have to talk about marriage again? I hated myself for the way I was talking. I hated myself for not telling her how I felt. "There is not a pilot today who does not expect to die, Hatsuyo," I explained. "Our luck has to run out. Skill has nothing to do with it. It is—" "You talk like a child, Saburo." Her eyes flashed with anger. She spoke so quietly I could hardly hear her. "You prattle on, and you know nothing of what you're saying. You do not know a woman's heart." She raised her arms in exasperation. "You talk of flying, of dying, Saburo. You talk of nothing else. You do not talk of living." She talked away, turning off the radio with an angry gesture. She ignored me and sat before the piano, her fingers moving idly over the keys. I was speechless. For several minutes I stood rooted in one spot, unable to speak a word. Finally I caught my voice again. "Hatsuyo, I don't know. Maybe if— Is it my fault? Can I help it if we are in a war?" I cried. "Why do you always talk like this?" "It is enough for me to see you here in this house," I went on. "I don't know," I stammered. "All I want to know, all I wish is that you will live long and happily." She slammed her hands down on the keys and whirled around. "I don't want to live long. What is it to live long and—" She placed her hand over her heart. "To be empty in here. None of us, here at home, or even a flyer, can live forever. Don't you understand that, Saburo?" Her anger startled me. A woman is happy, she spoke in a hush, only if she lives with the man she loves, even if it's for a few days and no more. She turned away bitterly, venting her anger on the piano. I stood transfixed, utterly at a loss as to what to say or do.